Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Steelrising is a new action RPG from Spiders, the studio that developed games such as Greedfall and Technomancer. I covered Greedfall back in 2019 when it came out in various videos, and I kinda did the same for Steelrising in my upcoming RPGs videos. This game is set in a clockpunk universe in an alternative version of French Revolution. You play as Aegis, a robot bodyguard of Queen Marie Antoinette, and you're on a mission to stop the murderous robot army of King Louis XVI. So the characters you'll meet throughout the game have actually existed, and the whole map of the game has been done with great attention to detail regarding this time period. It's a very unique setting, which is not that surprising to me at all, because this studio is well known for that.
Ah, my pet automat returns.
Anyway, I beat the whole game yesterday, so I'm going to try and give you some useful gameplay tips. Steelrising is heavily focused on action gameplay, and you have many different ways to experience the combat. This is a sponsored video, by the way, so thanks a lot to Spiders for reaching out to me with this opportunity. But let's not waste any more time. The game starts with giving you the option to choose between a couple of different classes. You can choose whatever weapon seems the most interesting to you, but this choice is not extremely important. You only get a couple of attribute points and a corresponding weapon that suits the quote-unquote class you choose. The game is actually classless. You can increase your attribute points however you want, as long as you gather enough anima points. As for the weapon, you'll be able to buy everything you see here very early in the game, and they are pretty cheap. Speaking of buying weapons, you should check the vessel store regularly, because you'll find new weapons to buy from time to time. Same goes for the armor pieces, by the way. But you also find a lot of weapons and armor by just exploring the map, usually in chests. Every weapon has a light attack, charge attack and a special move. All Aegis weapons use stamina as a resource. The amount of stamina they use depends on how heavy the weapon is. What I found really interesting about this, you can find the same weapon type like the halberds for example, that have different weights. So even though they have the same movesets, the attacks use different amounts of stamina because of their weight. Light attacks deal the least amount of damage at the cost of very low stamina usage. In my experience, the light attack is best used as a follow-up attack and when combined with the dodge ability. Opening the fight face to face with the enemy with a light attack is not a great idea. If you press the attack button right after you dodge, Aegis will do a forward light attack. You can cover a lot of ground like this and you usually end up flanking the target, which prevents you from getting hit most of the time. You can use all melee weapons like this, but the halberd is probably my most favorite in this situation. That's because it has a huge AoE sweep that will usually hit all nearby enemies. And speaking of multiple enemies on the screen, there is friendly fire between them, so more than often you can use that to your advantage. However, using the light attack in general is the easiest way to get you hits. That's because the enemies usually ignore this attack because of the lack of impact damage. Charge attack deals more impact damage, which means you can stagger or even knock down the enemy for a couple of seconds. You have to completely charge the attack in order to get a 100% chance to stun the enemy. But the stagger can happen quite often by just smacking the enemy with this attack and you don't have to charge it completely. Heavy and some medium weapons are much more effective when it comes to being able to stagger the enemy. The heavier the weapon, the greater the impact, equals a higher chance to stun or stagger the enemy. But like I said, heavy weapons use a lot more stamina, so you have to play more carefully and look for the right opportunity to charge your attacks. However, this doesn't mean you can't stun the enemies with lighter weapons as well. The lock-on symbol on enemies will start filling up when you attack them. When it's full, you can execute a critical attack move. It stuns the enemy for a second and deals some pretty good damage. This encourages you to be very aggressive with fast weapons because if you don't attack for a while, the bar starts depleting. It's not so important when you're fighting weaker enemies, but you should keep this mechanic in mind against elite and boss NPCs. The weight of the weapon also affects the damage scaling bonuses. Heavier weapons have better scaling with the power attribute. So if you decide to increase the power attribute when you have enough anima points, all weapons with high power scaling will benefit from this. Medium weight weapons scale better with agility, and there are also weapons that benefit from elemental alchemy attributes. Despite that, you can effectively use all weapons even without investing a single point in a corresponding attribute that scales with the weapon, especially if you decide to upgrade the weapon, which you can do up to 5 times. So don't get discouraged just because you didn't increase a certain stat that scales with the weapon you want to use. Upgrading the weapon even once makes a huge difference, so keep that in mind. Speaking of upgrading, you can buy all materials at a vessel, but you also find these items all over the place. It's really easy to gather enough anima points and just buy them out from the nearby vessel. While all of that is very useful to know, the action gameplay itself is way more important. You have 2 weapon slots and you can combine weapons however you want and switch them on the fly. I've spent the majority of my playthrough by combining the Leda halberd and the shield muskets, freezing stronger enemies with the frost attack from the musket, then switching back to my halberd for a charge attack is a very lethal combination. However, some enemies will have high resistance to frost damage, so it's a good thing to switch up your weapon combination every now and then. Speaking of muskets, some weapons and abilities will use alchemical capsules. You'll find these capsules on dead enemies, but don't forget that you can also buy them at every vessel, just like all the materials for upgrading the weapon. Every weapon in the game has a special move, which is what makes them unique. These special attacks are usually very strong offensive moves, but there are weapons with defensive moves as well. For example, the parry and the block mechanic are one of the special moves that you can find on some weapons. We can take the Nemesis Claws as an example. This weapon has the special parry move, along with some very fun moveset in general. If you press the quick attack button 4 times in a row, Aegis will execute a special attack which is quite strong. This is easily one of my most favorite fast weapons in the game. Using the special parry mechanic with this weapon feels quite rewarding. What's pretty cool about this special move is the ability to make it easier to pull it off. Aegis has a couple of model slots that you can activate, which can give you some various gameplay benefits. One of them is the model for increasing the parry window, which can be quite useful if you use a weapon with this special move, like the Nemesis Claws or Fallen Dagger. This can encourage people to use it, even if they're not that comfortable with parry mechanics in Souls-like games. But if you don't like the parry mechanic, you'll find other very useful fast weapons with cool special moves, like Falcon and Saber. On the other side, you'll find some very heavy weapons that might pique your interest because of their special moves. I almost completely switched to Volley Mallet when I first found it, because it has an insanely good special move. Combined with the heavy hits with lots of impact, it quickly became one of my most favorite weapons in general. Like I said before, it's a good idea to try and focus on charged attacks, especially with heavy weapons. And if you successfully execute a fully charged attack, it's also a good idea to try and use another one right after that, if you have the stamina of course. What you might find problematic, especially with weapons like Volley Mallet and Body of Work, is the short range. Most attacks with this weapon type have very poor range, but don't forget the dodge and running attacks. Running and dodge attacks are not the same. Aegis has a different attack animations for running attacks with each weapon. Some of them are really fast, even faster than the dodge attack. For example, the Nemesis Claws I mentioned before has a very fast running attack. Be sure to check out all attack combinations with the weapon you want to use, which includes the running and dodge attacks. What's also really useful to keep in mind, especially if you want to use slow weapons like the Volley Mallet, is the balance stats. When your balance is low, enemies will easily interrupt your attacks and stagger you, which can be very annoying when you're trying to charge up your attacks. Be sure to have at least some balance model installed or a couple of armor pieces which will increase these stats. The game also has jumping attacks, which can be useful sometimes, but I didn't use this move a lot throughout my playthrough. It can be situational though. Since I mentioned the Body of Work, the heavy weapon you can get right from the beginning of the game, the special block move it has shouldn't be underestimated. It's not the only weapon with the blocking ability as the special move. The musket I mentioned before and the armored fence also have this ability. Blocking is very strong in this game and you can use it effectively against all enemies. However, there are some attacks that are best to be avoided. The red flashing effect indicates a strong attack that can be blocked, so it's smart to move out of the way completely, especially against bosses. All enemies have a couple of tricks in their sleeves as well. If the time slows down when you attack the enemy, that means they're going to use the counter attack, so it's best to press the dodge button immediately. As you progress through the game, Aegis will unlock some special moves that can be used in and outside of combat. They deal different elemental damage and they can be very useful in combat as well. I focused a lot more on weapon abilities and regular moves, but you can easily combine these abilities with your attacks if you wish to. The damage they deal is pretty good as well, but they also use alchemical capsules. I really didn't use them a lot in combat in my playthrough, but all of them are kinda essential for getting around the map. We mentioned the use of stamina before, but I didn't talk about the rapid cooling mechanic. Well, actually, it's not called stamina in Steelrising, it's called endurance. When Aegis runs off endurance because of overheating, you can use the rapid cooling mechanic to restore endurance. The amount of endurance restored depends on your timing, and you'll take some frost damage every time you use this mechanic. Sometimes when you use it a couple of times in a row, the frost damage can completely freeze Aegis, so you have to spam the dodge button to break the stun. The disc on Aegis' back will always turn red when she drops below 50% of endurance. This mechanic can backfire if you use it too soon after you run out of endurance, because it will prolong the regeneration. If you find this mechanic tedious, you can activate the assist mode, which allows you to make it easier. Not just the rapid cooling mechanic, you can tweak some other difficulty settings as well. And those will be all the essential things you should know about the combat in Steelrising. Big thanks to Spiders for sponsoring the video. Don't forget to subscribe for more RPG contents. If you want to support the channel in the long run, consider becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member. You can get your name on the end credits, as well as some other perks like early access to videos, Discord roles, my plans for future content, etc, etc. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.